If you've got the DJI V2 goggles and you're using them with any video transmitter except the DJI O3 Air unit, in other words, all of the Caddx Vista generation of video transmitters, if you've got those goggles and that video transmitter, then there is a feature that DJI did not see fit to give you. You see, the goggles support a rudimentary form of on-screen display where you can go into your flight controller and you can move some elements around on screen like battery voltage and GPS coordinates. They support a rudimentary form of that OSD, but they do not support the full OSD, and they don't support the new feature of Betaflight 4.4, which is the high-definition OSD. So if you've got those goggles, the advice has been that you need to root them and you need to install WTFOS on them, and then that gives you access to all of these features that you want. And in the past, that has been a little bit more complicated than it is going to be today, because the folks who invented WTFOS and the rooting process have also invented a new tool that makes the process of rooting even easier than before. Today, I'm going to take you through that process. We're going to root these goggles, we're going to update them on the firmware, we're going to set up the OSD, we're going to go through the whole thing, start to finish. I'm Joshua Bardwell. You're going to learn something today. Before we get into this video, I want to make sure that I'm clear about who this video is and is not for, because there are people out there who cannot benefit from this. There are people who don't need to benefit from this, and I don't want you to waste your time watching a video that isn't going to be useful to you. I also want to tell you that there are some caveats later in the video. So if you watch this video, you pretty much think you got it, and then you skip the end. Don't do that. Either watch the whole video, or there are chapter markers and timestamps in the video description below, as well as in the timeline where you can fast forward and so forth. So definitely watch that chapter towards the end of the video, if nothing else. Who is this video for, or more realistically, who is it not for? If you are using the DJI Goggles 2, the DJI Goggles Integra, if you are using any Air unit, whether it's the O3 or the Vista or whatever, with those goggles, you do not need to do the stuff in this video. Those goggles support the full Betaflight OSD natively, and when you update the firmware on your Vista video transmitter to work with those goggles, it also gains that ability. The entire concept of rooting the goggles is moot, because the G2 and the Integra goggles have not been cracked. The keys have not been found to unlock the locks that prevent people from putting custom code on those goggles. So not only do you not have to root those goggles, you simply cannot root those goggles. However, you do get the core functionality that we're talking about. DJI put that functionality, the OSD functionality, in those goggles, and you don't need to do this in order to get that functionality. If you're using the V2 goggles and you have switched the V2 goggles over to the O3 Air unit mode because you're using the V2 goggles with an O3 Air unit, you also don't need to care about this, because when the V2 goggles are switched to O3 Air unit mode and used with an O3 Air unit, they also already have the functionality I'm going to show you. DJI gave it to you. It is only people using the V2 goggles with the older generation of video transmitters that need what I'm about to show you. And there's a whole lot of you out there, so I'm one of you. I still have a lot of quads with Vistas in them. I actually have more Vistas than I do O3s. So the first thing we need to do is root the goggles. And the way that we used to do that is to go to this website, fpv.wtf, and plug in the goggles and go to the root section and root the goggles. But we're not going to do that today, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to make this video. You see, you can only root the goggles if a certain firmware is on the goggles, and if the firmware is not on the goggles, then there is another process you have to go through that rolls the firmware back, and it's kind of complicated and has a lot of details. We're not going to do that today because the FPV-WTF devs have released a tool that will, in one fell swoop, flash the goggles to a firmware that can be rooted, root them, and then update them to the latest firmware, so you're just good to go. And that's what I want to show you in this video. In order to do that, we're going to go to this website, github.com/fpvwtf/butter. And butter is the tool that they made to allow you to wipe the goggles back to an older firmware, even when DJI doesn't want you to. In fact, if you've ever bricked your goggles, or your goggles are just being really screwy and you don't know how to fix them, butter will sort of give you a fresh, clean slate. This is a super, super useful tool, and anybody who owns the V2 goggles should know about it. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see that Butter can be used with lots of different hardware. There is a version of Butter to wipe the goggles V1 back to firmware 0608 or 0606, for the goggles V2, for the air units, and so on. But we're going to be specifically using this, the 01070000 SUPERPACK. And this is the thing that's going to wipe the goggles back to an older firmware, root them, and then flash them forward to the latest version at the time of making this video, which is 01070000. We could do all of these steps individually, but it would be more tedious, and it's nice to have this SUPERPACK that can do it all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and click and download this SUPERPACK. It's going to come down as a zip file. I'm going to extract that zip file to a folder on my hard drive. And here I've got WTFOS Butter 107 SUPERPACK extracted to a folder. The next thing you need to do is install the drivers. This utility requires a special driver that your system doesn't have, and the SUPERPACK comes down with a driverinstaller.exe. There actually seem to be several different versions of this driver because I've downloaded different Butter packages to flash different devices. And sometimes when I go to run the utility, it doesn't work. It doesn't detect the goggles. And if I run the driver installer that came with the zip file, then suddenly it starts working. So the first thing you should do is you should always run the driver installer here that came down with the zip file so it can get the drivers that are most likely to be appropriate for whatever it is you're trying to do. So the drivers are installing. That's going to take a few minutes to finish, and I'll see you here when it's done. Once all the 3 drivers have been installed, we will press any key to close the installer. Next, we need to run this windows-runme.bat. And in case you haven't figured it out by now, the tool that I'm using runs on Windows. There's also a Linux version, although it doesn't seem to be a Linux version of the SUPERPACK, just the individual ones. I'm not sure. I don't do a lot with Linux. And if you're on Mac OS, you are out of luck. Unfortunately, the devs could not get the drivers to work right on Mac OS. So, sorry. I'll double-click the windows-runme.bat, and it will start by saying, press any key to continue. So I will. It'll say, connect your goggles via USB. At this point, your goggles must be powered down. We're going to plug USB in with the goggles powered down. And the reason for this is that normally the goggles will not let you flash them in ways that DJI doesn't want you to. So for example, if you update the goggles to a certain firmware version, DJI will not let you roll them back to a previous version that might prevent you from rooting them. Or the goggles may just be bricked and can't be updated at all. But DJI devices, I think it's all DJI devices, although I'm not sure, have a short 5-second window where they first boot up, where you can, if you catch them during that window, you can flash them in ways that DJI doesn't let you, and that lets you, well, flash them back to an earlier version that DJI doesn't like, or restore them from being bricked. And so we need to plug them in with them powered off so we can catch that. They call it the fastboot window. We're going to press any key, and it's going to say, please power your goggles on now. And notice that it says, waiting for DJI recovery device to enumerate. When I plug in, you're going to hear doot-a-doot. There's going to be a USB plug, and then 5 seconds later, it'll go doot-a-doot, doot-a-doot. And that is the fastboot device going away and the regular DJI device coming back. But what we're going to do is we're going to catch that fastboot window, and we're going to stop that. Ready? Here we go. Okay, there it was, and it got it. Do you see that now it has begun flashing? That's what we want. Now, if you hear doot-a-doot, and then 5 seconds later, doot-a-doot, doot-a-doot, that means that you missed the fast boot window. And there are a couple reasons why this might have happened. The number one reason is that the drivers aren't correct. When I have had that happen, what I do is I go back to the FPV-WTF website, and there is actually a separate driver download, which is here. Windows users need to install drivers first. Sometimes this driver link works for me when the one that came down in the zip file didn't work for me, and I don't know why. Sometimes this one doesn't work, and I use the one in the zip file, and it works. If your device did not catch the goggles during that window, and this batch file just sat there doing nothing, then try installing the other driver installer, either the one in the zip file or the one from this link. I'll put this link in the video description below. You can get it. Sometimes one works, sometimes the others work. I don't really know why. The other thing that can cause that is if you are plugged into like a USB hub, it may not work. If you're plugged into the USB ports on the front of your computer, depending on how they're connected to the motherboard, it may not work. You may need to plug into the USB port on the back of the computer. If you're plugged in with a USB-C to C cable, sometimes I've had that not work, but an A to C cable does work. These are various things you can try if, when you power the goggles up, they simply are not detected. But what we hope happens is that we begin seeing this stuff here, and it begins the process of flashing, rooting, and flashing the goggles. Let's watch that happen so we can see the major steps. After a little while, the goggles will reboot themselves. Then it says, asking nicely. This doesn't work in my experience. And then it says waving wand, asking again, this time with some gusto, and waiting for the device to reboot. I have never had asking nicely work. I don't know what that means, but don't worry if that happens to you. It's completely normal. The device will reboot. We then get waiting for DJI serial device again. And in my experience, this usually works. Here's the first of those gotchas that you need to know about. I recently tried to help some folks with this, and when we got to about this stage, it threw an error message. And the error message said something about not liking the path to C:\users\username. Like, check this out. So if we go to my C drive, we can go to C:\users, and there is a folder for each of the users who logs into your computer. And in this case, the problem is that the username had non-English characters in it. So if your username has, in this case, it was specifically Cyrillic characters, but I think there may be issues with other non-Western, non-Latin characters. If your username has any non-Latin characters in it, then you may get an error message and this process may not be able to complete. The way around that is to go to Windows and add a new user. So I can go here and I can say, add someone else to this PC, and I don't have this person's, just let me add a freaking user. No, I don't want a Microsoft account. Yes, okay. Test user. It doesn't matter. We're going to create a new user. That user is not going to have any non-Western, non-Latin characters in their name. And then you're going to switch to that user. You're going to log into the computer as that user, and you're going to run the process, and it should succeed. When you get to this stage, the goggles are finished flashing and rooting, but we're not done. We've got a few more things to do. But before I show you the next step, I want to see if I can reproduce this gotcha that affected me the last time I did this. You see, I was trying to use these goggles to spectate someone who was flying the O3 Air unit. So I went to Settings, I went to Device, and I went to Switch to DJI O3 Air unit. Okay, then as required, I power cycled the goggles, and that put them into O3 Air Unit mode. Then I received this screen. Great. I selected my language, and this bug should reproduce itself. It's working fine. I'm unable to reproduce the error. Well, on the one hand, I'm happy because that means this error probably won't affect you. On the other hand, I'm annoyed because I don't know why this error isn't reproducing itself. It should be consistent. But the error was that I got a message on screen that said my firmware version was out of date and I had to connect the goggles to the DJI Fly app, and the goggles basically froze up. Like, they literally just didn't work. That's all they would do. The menus wouldn't come up, nothing. Ultimately, the way that I fixed it was to connect it to my phone and connect it to the DJI Fly app, and then it was like, oh, if you have a firmware update, do you want to? And I was like, no. And then it was like, okay, fine. And then the error message went away and everything was fine. If you run into that situation, unfortunately, I can't tell you what causes it, but if you do run into it, you're going to have to connect your goggles to the DJI Fly app on the phone. I wasn't able to find any other way to clear that up. But we're not here to talk about the DJI O3. We're here to go back to the DJI digital FPV system and set up WTFOS and the OSD. So let's do that. And the next step in that process is going to be to plug in a USB to the goggles and go to the webpage fpv.wtf. And when we plug the goggles in, we should see successfully connected to your device. If you see that, it means that the goggles have been rooted successfully and you are ready to proceed to the next step. If you don't see that, I kind of don't know what to tell you, because the whole point of butter is to like wipe the goggles back to a definitely known good state. I suppose you could have like an app running in the background, like if you're running the DJI Assistant app, it may interfere with the ability to do so. Have all the apps closed in the background, but you should get successfully connected. I don't know. Try a different USB cable. Power cycle. On some devices, a C-to-C cable won't work. That kind of thing. Once you see successfully connected, you will go to WTFOS and you will install WTFOS on your device. I have had this process error out sometimes, and basically power cycling the goggles and just trying again pretty much always works. Hopefully it'll go smoothly the first time for me. It's worth pointing out that you definitely do need internet for this process. So if for some reason you're, well, I don't know how you're watching this video if you don't have internet, but that's up to you. You do need internet for this process. And now we come to the second of the important gotchas and bugs that you need to be aware of. There has been a bug in WTFOS that under some conditions causes the goggles to reboot during flight. Literally, they just reboot. This bug is not super common, and the WTFOS devs have taken some steps to try to fix it. It's not completely eliminated, and it has happened to people that they're flying and the goggles basically reboot. Actually, the goggles don't entirely reboot. What happens is that the user interface of the goggles reboots, so the link is still there, you just can't see what your aircraft is seeing, and it takes about 10 or 15 seconds for the operating system to reboot and you to get your image back. If you are in a situation where that would cause a major problem for you, then the official advice is don't install WTFOS and don't use these features. I'm installing it because I want OSD in my goggles and I'm going to take my chances. It's up to you to decide how you feel about that. Once WTFOS is installed, the screen should look like this. The install and update options will be grayed out and the remove option will appear. Of course, we're not going to remove. Instead, we're going to go to the package manager and we're going to install the package that will let us have on-screen display. And the package that we want is the MSP-OSD package. So we'll just hit install. And that is done. In order to get this working, we also have to root and install the MSP plugin on our Vista. The good news is that there isn't a lot of shenanigans with the firmware on the Vista. We simply will plug in USB. I'm also going to get this little USB powered fan that I like to use to blow on the Vista because this process does take a minute. And if the Vista overheats in the middle of the process, it, well, probably won't be bricked or anything, but it'll be annoying. And I'm going to plug in and power up the Vista. And in just a second, we should see it appear as connected here at the top of the screen. Bingo. And there we go. The USB drive appears. We'll close that. Successfully connected to your device. Now, if you have not previously rooted, this one's already been rooted. If you have not previously rooted, when you plug it in, you will need to go to root and root device and wait for that to happen. A word of note, if this is a brand new Vista that has never been activated, this process will fail. You do need to connect it to the DJI companion app and activate it before you can root it. Once it's rooted, we'll go to WTFOS and we will install. This one is already also installed. And then we will go to Package Manager as before, and we will install the MSP-OSD package. And in this case, it is also already installed because I've done this before, but you would go ahead and install it. Now that we've got the DJI system rooted and WTFOS installed, the next thing we need to do is set up our flight controller. But before we go on to that, I want to just take a second and remind you that I have a Patreon. Patreon is a website where you can subscribe to me for as little as $2 a month, or more if you feel like I've earned it. Just ask yourself how much value you get from my content. What is that worth to you every month? head on over to the link in the video description below, join my Patreon at that level. Patrons get access to my Discord server, which is a really fantastic research for just chatting with people in FPV, helping you solve problems. There's even a buy-sell trade forum where you can buy and sell stuff that you don't want anymore or get stuff that you do want. But mostly, I hope you join my Patreon because you've been watching my content. You found me on the internet somehow. I've been helping you help learn how to set up quadcopters. You've been enjoying my content, and finally the day has come that you're like, fine, you got me. I'll give back. If that day is today, head on down to that link. If today is not today, keep on watching the content. Keep making it. And, maybe that day will come. Once that's all done, the next thing we need to do is set up the flight controller. So I'm going to unplug USB from the Vista and plug it into the flight controller. And we'll start up Betaflight. And the first thing I want you to see is that my quadcopter is on Betaflight 4.4. This is significant because Betaflight 4.4 supports high definition or widescreen on-screen display. The Betaflight OSD by default assumes that you are on a standard definition analog screen. So everything is 4:3 and in the center of your widescreen DJI goggles. But wouldn't it be nice if you could take those OSD elements and move them over to the sides of your widescreen? You got widescreen goggles. Of course, you also want a widescreen OSD. In addition, the Betaflight OSD makes the letters of the OSD really big because analog screens don't have a lot of resolution, so we need big letters so we can read them. But if we have high definition digital goggles, we can have smaller letters, and that makes things look nicer. You definitely want this feature. I definitely suggest trying to be on Betaflight 4.4 if you're going to use this feature. It's not mandatory, but it is very, very nice. Whichever way you decide to go, the way to set it up could not be simpler. Haha, right? Well, could not be simpler in a 27-minute long something video about. Anyway, moving on. Well, we're going to go to the ports tab and we're going to make note of which UART number our air unit is on. So we're going to know that because it's going to have configuration/MSP enabled on it. Now, in my case, there's only one UART with MSP on it. We're not counting the USB UART. That one doesn't count. It's UART number 1. That's where my air unit is. A few flight controllers, specifically flight controllers that have a built-in Bluetooth radio, and you can connect to them with your phone and configure them, you might see multiple UARTs with MSP enabled. In that case, you're just going to have to guess or look at your documentation to see which one of those is your air unit and which one is the Bluetooth device. Before you start jacking around with all this, though, hang on. UART number 1. I'm going to remember mine is UART number 1. We'll come back to that. Go to the presets tab and save a freaking backup of your configuration because we're about to start screwing around. And if we screw around and mess things up, we want to have a backup so we can go back to when it was working. Always do that. And when we screw things up and we want to get it back to working, just hit load backup and load that file back in again. So here in the presets tab, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first select the version of Betaflight that I've got. If you've got 4.3, you want to pick that. We're on 4.4, so we're going to pick that. And then I'm going to type WTFOS and find this preset. OSD for FPV WTF, DJI 03 Avatar HD. This is the one we want. If we have 4.3, there is a similar one called FPV WTF MSP-OSD. Only pick the preset that matches the Betaflight version that you're on. I'm going to pick this one. And we also need to choose set to HD OSD. We definitely want that on if we're using Betaflight 4.4. Map to DisplayPort, we want that on. And use DisplayPort and MSP VTX on whichever UART number you think that the air unit is connected to. In my case, it's UART 1. Having done all that, we will choose pick and we will hit save and reboot. Now that should set everything up and have it working correctly, but it's my experience that it often requires one more thing to be done before everything works correctly. You see, in my experience, when you go into the OSD tab, you may not see the widescreen that I have here. You may see the older narrow screen from standard definition. Betaflight doesn't always seem to know the correct canvas size, so it knows how big your goggle display is. In order to fix that, you're going to need to go to this paste bin link, which I'll put in the video description below, and scroll down to find these lines. Set OSD canvas width equals 60, canvas height equals 22. I'm going to copy those lines, In Betaflight, I'm going to go to the CLI tab and I'm going to paste those in and then type the word save. And when we do that, we should come back here to the OSD tab and the canvas should be correctly sized. But you probably don't actually have any OSD elements laid out. You can do that by manually clicking them on or off and dragging them. You can literally just drag them around on screen anywhere you want. Or you could copy mine if you want to. And you can do that by going back to this paste bin link and just taking all of the lines here and pasting them into your CLI. However you do it, go ahead and set up some OSD elements and let's see if this freaking thing is working. Now, when the goggles first begin to power up, we're going to see a couple of things that are different now that we've got them rooted with WTFOS on them. In the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you should see it loading some fonts. And that's an indicator that, like, there you go, font waiting, OSD waiting. Those things are an indicator that the goggles are rooted and they're like trying to make the OSD work. I'm gonna need to bind them, damn it. When I buttered them, I lost all my binds. So hang on, let me bind them. And sure enough, hallelujah, the OSD is working. You can see there I've got full on-screen display. Amazing. That's what we want. One more gotcha before we wrap up the video. When you buttered the goggles, you also got rid of the 1200 milliwatt hack. Is that true? No? Oh, it's still there. How is that possible? I don't understand. Great. Well, make sure that that didn't get wiped. And if you've done the FCC unlock on your Vista, make sure that that also didn't get wiped, but mine didn't. So cool. That's great. Now that you've got the OSD working, there's a couple more cool features that you're going to want to check out. And the first one is the ability to have a custom font. That default font, it looks okay, but there's some really cool looking fonts that look even better, including some fonts that have color. And I've got a tutorial about how to do that. I'm gonna put a card on screen and a link in the video description below where you can check that out. In addition, you've got on-screen display in your goggles, which is good, but it's not actually recorded in the DVR. There's a separate tool that can actually take the font files that are created on your SD card and overlay them with your DVR. And if that's something that you're interested in, guess what? Card on screen, link in the video description below. I will see you there. Happy flying.